Hello. Hello, hello. Hi. Hello, everyone. What a sea of massed humans. I know there are some very vulnerable people in the room tonight, and they don't often get to go out. And they get to do that tonight because you're all doing your bit, and it really means the world to have literally hundreds of people do that for each other. So my heart is very full. So thank you. My name is Mary. I'm from Lighthouse Books, and I am just here to invite you all to put your hands together in a second for Gemma Milne, who is going to be hosting Naomi Klein, and the woman herself will walk out. Just in terms of housekeeping, you will have seen the books tables. There will be a book signing afterwards. You can buy books afterwards. The loos are out there, so if you need to go at any point, feel free. There will be time for questions. Questions are, much as we might like it to be otherwise, a single sentence with a question mark at the end. So I am entrusting you to remember we will have limited time, and there will be a signing queue, so if there are things that you wanted to ask and say to Naomi, you can do it at that point. But to keep your questions nice and short so we can have fun with it. But I'm just going to make sure Harry, who is filming, we've got the all clear. They're going to start on the lectern just in case that changes your frame. So now is the time. You put your hands together. Will you join me in welcoming Naomi Klein and Gemma Milne?
Wow. Thank you so much, so many of you, for coming out tonight, not to see me, to see Naomi. I'm really thrilled about this event. I've been excited for a long time. I'm sure there's many of you in the audience who, like me, have read Doppelganger and just thought it was totally fab. So many themes that we're going to dive into tonight and hear a lot more from Naomi around her inspiration for the book and a lot about going a lot deeper in some of these themes that have been brought up. Naomi probably doesn't need much of an introduction, but for anyone who's new to Naomi and her work, she is the award-winning author of international bestsellers, including This Changes Everything, The Shock Doctrine, No Logo, No Is Not Enough, and On Fire, and they've been published in more than 35 languages. She's an associate professor at the Department of Geography at the University of British Columbia, the founding co-director of UBC's Centre of Climate Justice, and she's an honorary professor of media and climate at Rutgers. Her writings appeared in leading publications all around the world, which I'm sure, like me, you have seen, and she's actually just launched a regular column for The Guardian. Please put all of your hands together for Naomi Klein.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gemma. Thank you, Gemma. I'm just delighted to be in conversation with you, and huge thanks to Lighthouse Books and to my publisher at Allen Lane. I'm just going to start with a little reading from the very beginning of Doppelganger. In my defense, it was never my intent to write this book. I did not have time, no one asked me to, and several people strongly cautioned against it. Not now. Not with the literal and figurative fires roiling our planet, and certainly not about this. Other Naomi. That is how I refer to her now, this person with whom I have been chronically confused for over a decade. My big-haired doppelganger. A person whom so many others appear to find indistinguishable from me. A person who does many extreme things that cause strangers to chastise me, or thank me, or express their pity for me. The very fact that I have to refer to her with any kind of code speaks to the absurdity of my situation. For a quarter of a century, I have been a person who writes about corporate power and its ravages. I sneak into abusive factories in faraway countries and across borders to military occupations. I report in the aftermath of oil spills and Category 5 hurricanes. I write books of big ideas about serious subjects. And yet, in the months and years during which this text came into being, a time when cemeteries ran out of space and billionaires blasted themselves into outer space, everything else that I had to write or might have written appeared only as an unwanted intrusion, a rude interruption. In June 2021, as this project began to truly spiral out of my control, a strange new weather event dubbed a heat dome descended on the southern coast of British Columbia, the part of Canada where I now live with my family. The thick air felt like a snarling, invasive entity with malevolent intent. More than 600 people died, most of them elderly. An estimated 10 billion marine creatures were cooked alive on our shores. An entire town went up in flames. It's very rare for this out-of-the-way, sparsely populated spot to make international headlines, but the heat dome made us briefly famous. An editor in New York asked if I, as someone engaged in the climate fight for 15 years, would file a report about what it was like to live through this unprecedented climate event. I'm working on something else, I told him, the stench of death filling my nostrils. Can I ask what? You cannot. There were plenty of other important things I neglected during this time of feverish subterfuge. That summer, I allowed my 9-year-old to spend so many hours watching a gory nature show called Animal Fight Club that he began to ram me at my desk like a great white shark. I engaged in all of this neglect so that I could, what? Check her serially suspended Twitter account? Study her appearances on Steve Bannon's live streams for insights into their electric chemistry? Read or listen to yet another of her warnings that basic health measures were actually a covert plot orchestrated by the Chinese Communist Party, Bill Gates, Anthony Fauci, and the World Economic Forum to sow mass death on such a scale it could only be the work of the devil himself. My deepest shame rests with the unspeakable number of podcasts I mainlined, the sheer volume of hours I will never get back. I whimpered one night into my best friend's voicemail, I feel closer to the hosts of Conspirituality than I do to you. A little bit more. In stories about doubles, twins, and imposters, it is often the case that the doppelganger acts as an unwelcome kind of mirror, showing the protagonist a vain and venal version of themselves. It will not give too much away to say that while watching my doppelganger, I have felt that unwelcome wince of recognition more than once. Yet what drove me to write this book, sticking with it against all good judgment, is that the more I looked at her disastrous choices, and the cruel ways she was often treated by others, the more I came to feel as if I were not only seeing undesirable parts of myself, but a magnification of many undesirable aspects of our shared culture as well. The ambient and all-pervasive hunger for ever more fleeting relevance, the disposability with which we treat people who mess up, the trivialization of words and displacements of responsibility, and much else. In the end, looking at her helped me see myself more clearly, but it also, oddly, helped me to better see the dangerous systems and dynamics we are all trapped inside. This, then, is not a biography of other Naomi, nor does it offer a psychoanalytic diagnosis of her behaviors. It is an attempt to use my own doppelganger experience, the havoc wreaked and the lessons learned about me, her, and us, as a guide into and through what I have come to understand as our doppelganger culture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi. I'm really happy, actually, that you read that bit, because when I was preparing to come here this evening, I thought, for anyone who hasn't yet read the book, and there are copies outside that you can buy if you have not, or you can buy one for your friend, of course. Some people in the audience might be thinking, why write this when you're normally writing about these quote-unquote real things?
Yeah.
But it kind of, I think you really beautifully talk about this idea of realness online versus what we often talk about as absurdity, or what happens on Twitter is not real life. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on that feeling of realness, or what is real about online that made you want to go a bit deeper.
Yeah. So, quite seriously, the book is not about her. Naomi Wolf, for those of you who have no idea what I've been talking about, which is fair enough. It is true that I do really have had this identity confusion, but it really accelerated during the pandemic when so many of us who were fortunate enough to be able to work from home or be, quote unquote, locked down, were represented to the world through our digital doubles. And so it raises these questions about whether, not just whether what happens online is real, but whether we ourselves online are real, whether that is really us. And, as you know, my first book dealt with the issue of branding, corporate branding, and the way it was changing our world. No Logo came out just on the cusp of the new millennium. It came out right between 1999 and 2000. And it was tracking a shift in the corporate world where all of these companies were announcing that they were no longer making products. Their primary business was the creation of these brand identities, which they then projected onto their products. But the work of product making was much less important. And then you had the first human brands announcing themselves, but they were all celebrities. And the experience of publishing No Logo was very weird for me personally because it sort of turned me into a brand, and I became this kind of signifier for a certain kind of political movement. And I was sort of horrified by that. And so I decided that the only thing I could do was become a very bad brand, which I knew from my study of branding meant, not repeating myself over and over again. So, the work that I did since, after No Logo, really had nothing to do with marketing and branding, but it was kind of pulling at me because I was seeing how the students I teach are trained to think of themselves as brands. It's everywhere in the academy, obviously in media. I feel like it's really changing our social relationships, that we're unclear on whether that version of ourselves that we're performing online is really us. And we're also not clear on whether each other are human online. And that changes how we treat each other. I also think it has some pretty serious impacts on social movements when social movements start acting like brands. So basically, I just used my doppelganger identity confusion as an excuse to go back into this material and look at various kinds of doubling, including the way we double ourselves.
I think it's a really interesting topic, particularly at the moment, given what's happening right now with social media, particularly, Musk taking over Twitter. Yeah. Let's be honest, we're not going to call it X, are we? And, I don't know about any of you, but, I felt so ridiculous, but I felt really anxious when all that was happening. And I don't know whether that's just because I have a lot of Twitter friends. A lot of my real friendships started on Twitter. You're good at it. Am I? Am I brand Gemma on Twitter? But that's it. You cultivate this, exactly. Yeah. And my anxiety there was like, oh, am I going to lose people? Am I going to start being misunderstood? I'm a researcher and writer. I need to have people understand who I am. And there's this real anxiety about being known, and what we're saying is got. And you touched upon that, like whose responsibility almost is it to make sure what you're saying is understood? Is it the platform changing the autocorrect so that people misunderstand you, or is it how good your writing is? Talk a little bit about that anxiety of being understood.
Yeah, well, as I said, it got a lot worse during the pandemic for a variety of reasons. Some of it was that Wolf started saying things that sounded a little bit like the shock doctrine. Yeah. I would argue with the facts and evidence removed, but it sort of had the shape of the shock doctrine in the sense that the shock doctrine is a book that is about how states of emergency have been systematically exploited by elites to push through very unpopular, undemocratic agendas, right? And anybody familiar with what is going on in conspiracy culture right now knows that the animating sort of mega story is that COVID was a plot by the elites, by Davos and the Chinese Communist Party to push through a great reset that involves forcing people to eat bugs and locking them in their homes, taking away their freedoms, and so on. And the truth is, the World Economic Forum did have ideas about how to come back from the pandemic. They were the same ideas that they always have been advancing for a long time: 3D printing and kind of green market economy. What else? Digital IDs. It's not original, but if you haven't been following it, it's interesting because we live in a culture that has sort of normalized the idea that our politicians and the richest people in the world go up to a Swiss mountaintop every year and talk about how they're going to fix the world's problems. But you can imagine that if you hadn't been following that and you're like, oh my God, have you heard about this Davos thing? It really is a conspiracy. So it started accelerating because of that, because there was this story that sounded shock doctrine-y, and there was somebody named Naomi who was talking about it. So you can see how busy people who are nervous and online too much, reading very fast, which is how we all consume information online, started to get confused. And I started to get confused because people were saying that the algorithm was now prompting them to be confused, that it was autofilling my name and things like that, and putting my image up when they were searching, things like that. So that's another feeling that I think that anxiety. One of my great anxieties about social media is that there's no one you can complain to, right? Like if you are being misunderstood fundamentally, you can't. There's no phone number. Like you can't. Yeah. So I wanted to capture the uncanniness of our moment in time. I think this book is about big ideas still, but it is a weirder book because I think these are weirder times. But I am still trying to do what I've done in earlier moments where I think something big has changed, and I think it's worth trying to make a little bit of a map together of where we are now. I think we're somewhere different than we were before the pandemic. Arundhati Roy wrote that very memorable piece, I'm sure many of you read it, "The Pandemic is a Portal," in the early months, where she said, this is too big, too global, too synchronous, too cataclysmic for it not to take us somewhere else. And she was saying we have a choice point about what we're going to bring with us through the portal. We could decide to bring our hatreds and our smoggy skies. We could decide to pack more lightly and change our priorities, but make no mistake, we're going through the portal, we're going somewhere new. And so I do sort of feel like we have a bit of a collective case of jet lag where we're not sure whether we're going back or we're going to somewhere else. And, this is just, you're an academic, you're a scholar, you know that this is collective work, and this is just my attempt at a first draft of a sketch of life through the portal. And the fun part is now where people are like, you missed a mountain, and there's also a path over there. And, I think there's a lot of mapping to be done.
Well, I think that point comes through really strongly in the book. You talk about, thinking as a form of doubling. I think it was a Arendt quote used. Dialogue between me and myself, this sort of idea of a doppelganger being something that kind of allows you to oscillate. And what you said earlier about being kind of a bad brand, you're not sticking on I have the same, I have a speaker agent, and they're like, what's your one keynote? And I'm like, that's easy to sell, but it's dull for a writer. And
repeat yourself forever.
It's bad branding. I'd have way more Twitter followers. But I guess that point around trying to work through and think through as opposed to trying to get an answer. I work in science. That is often where problems happen with misunderstanding, the sense of trying to get a simple answer to some kind of collective unease. You mentioned that Davos example is brilliant. And maybe we can talk a little bit around, you talk a lot about in the book around this idea that it's kind of everybody's got the same issues. We've got the same sort of unease or anxieties. We're annoyed about the same things, really. Those that are in this mirror world and us that are, well, some people in this room might be in the mirror world, who knows? Maybe you're 1 foot in, 1 foot out. But, it's like, how do we examine this idea of us having the same feelings but different facts?
Yeah, exactly, And this is one of the key ideas in the book is the role that Wolf plays for me is she's really like the White Rabbit in Alice in Wonderland, of just kind of, I follow her down the rabbit hole, but then try to understand what is going on down there. And it really is significant that she is somebody who came to prominence when I was in university as basically the most famous feminist of her generation when she wrote The Beauty Myth, wrote many other liberal feminist books, advised Al Gore, was his senior advisor, was very much like in the Washington liberal circle, married to a White House speechwriter, like really in there. And now she is on Steve Bannon's show sometimes every single day. They co-wrote a book together. She takes pictures of her gun. She talks about how there's this war on the border. And she is not the only person who has changed dramatically in recent years. I'm sure you can think of people, I'm sure there are local examples of this. I can think of, at least 10 people I know in the media who seem to change very dramatically during COVID. And so, and I think in our personal relationships, a lot of us have had those feelings, right? Of just, I can't talk to my sister anymore. I can't, like, what happened to that yoga teacher, right? Why is she talking about QAnon? There's been a kind of migration of the mind, but what's interesting is that if you go down the rabbit hole in what I call the mirror world, they say the same thing about us. They say we're in a simulation. They say we've changed, that we're the ones who have become incredibly obedient and pro-elite. I've been captured by the globalists, according to this story. And so we are not having a disagreement about different interpretations of reality. We're having a disagreement about who is in reality and who is in kind of a simulation of reality, like a world of their own creation. That's a pretty dangerous place to be in. And I recognize that some of you are probably going, that's just in America. But it really is, it's pretty prominent here as well. And I live in Canada. I started the pandemic in the US and moved back to Canada to be close to my parents, and then stayed. And we were feeling pretty smug. We handled the pandemic well. We had really low COVID rates, and the next thing we knew, the capital city, Ottawa, was occupied by truckers for 3 weeks. And it's redrawing the political map. It's redrawing the political map in New Zealand, in Germany. It's everywhere. Even Totnes, apparently, which I last visited when I was researching This Changes Everything, because it was a paragon of green politics, has changed very, very radically. So, yeah, I think we really do need to pay attention to this. But yeah, like what I find when I listen to Bannon, and I have listened to hundreds of hours of Bannon, and he's an important figure for us to understand because he is very actively weaving together a network of far-right political parties around the world, right? He was very close to Giorgia Meloni in Italy, to Viktor Orban, to Bolsonaro, et cetera. And so when I listen to Bannon, what scares me is not that my doppelganger is on there, it's that the whole thing is kind of a doppelganger of the left that I have been a part of my whole life. That they're talking about big pharma, they're talking about big tech, they're talking about corporate media consolidation, but it's through this warped mirror. But the thing about Bannon, and of course it pivots to transphobia, it pivots to xenophobia. It's not like it's actually trying to do anything about these forces. What it's doing is picking up on the feelings that are powerful and real, right? And using them for, I think, very nefarious political gains. He did that in 2016 for Trump by talking about free trade deals when the Democrats had stopped talking about free trade deals. And there are a lot of workers in the US who had voted again and again for Democrats who said that they were going to renegotiate these corporate trade deals and then didn't. And so he's, like, I think what's happening with the right in the US, but not just in the US, is they're picking up issues that the center left, but even parts of what would see itself as the actual independent left have really stopped engaging with as much as they used to. And politics hates a vacuum, and somebody is going to speak to that. And so that's why I say they're a doppelganger of the left. I'm not saying we're flip sides of the same coin, we're the same. I'm saying something very weird is happening, and we need to pay close attention. Doppelganger stories are always warnings.
It was when I was reading your book, I mean, there were some really interesting examples that pop up a lot in my world, in the sort of tech and science critique world. You talk a lot about mass surveillance, that being a kind of reason why people are drawn into these places, the unease they feel about mass surveillance. You talked about, Steve Bannon, I didn't know this, has a transhumanist correspondent, which surprised me.
Transhumanism, yeah.
Right, but that kind of surprised me. I thought, wouldn't they be up for transhumanism? I was thinking kind of like the Tez Creole people, right? The sort of Silicon Valley-esque, but actually it turns out they think it's not God's will or whatever. And
well, they think it's a powerful subject for people. I don't know what Steve Bannon thinks. I think he might be fine with it. You know what I mean? But he sees that people are unsettled by it. Yeah.
But it's interesting that some of these ideas are similar, and yet you talked about this idea of when people in this world, the diagonalists, I think you call them, touch a subject, it then makes it very difficult for everybody else to talk about it, because it kind of turns it into absurdity, or kind of, this idea of the, Boris Johnson kind of, you can't really laugh at him anymore because it's all so ridiculous. And I was thinking about, I used to write about science fraud quite a lot, and a lot of people would say to me, this is a really difficult thing to write about because you're reducing trust in scientists by pointing out when someone has forged a science paper. And I'm like, but we still have to talk about when people do science fraud. We can't just assume that science is fully trustworthy and all good people. But I think it's a similar sort of problem here.
Exactly. And I think, if there's one thing I've learned from this, it's that you have to, there's an even more reason for you to do it now, precisely because there is this doppelganger of journalism about science frauds, which does not understand the data that it is analyzing, that is being done, I believe, in bad faith, right? But if you can't turn to credible sources and check the facts, then people are going to fall even further. And so, one example, there's so many examples, but the lab, the COVID origin story, it became sort of untouchable to investigate whether anything that questioned whether or not it came from a wet market, right? Why was that a partisan issue? Why was that a left-right issue? It was because that was a mirror world. Steve Bannon was talking about it being a lab leak, and he was saying it was a bioweapon. It's not a bioweapon, but it's possible. It's worth investigating. And the more people are not finding that story in a credible news source, the more they're going to go do their own research, and they're going to end up with some very uncredible news sources. I would say the same is true of adverse vaccine reactions. Some people have adverse vaccine reactions, and there was a fear of even just acknowledging that, right? And so, that's another example. Or some of the downsides of vaccine verification apps, of QR codes. There are downsides. When you have more technology mediating access to space, that's definitely going to have an impact on who has access to that space. We should have had those debates. And so part of what I'm sort of mapping here is that I think we became way too reactive. And in the early days of the pandemic, a lot of people on the left were very focused on the injustice of the way the vaccines were being patented, marketed, and distributed, right? We were focused on the fact that these vaccines were developed with public dollars, that the entire business model relied on governments buying them. Why should they be patented? And there were some loud debates about that, challenging Bill Gates and his alliance with the drug companies, saying that the vaccines shouldn't be patented, that everybody in the world should have access to them, we shouldn't be hoarding them in the global north. But once the vaccine conspiracy theory around Bill Gates and the vaccines being trackers and all that stuff, it suddenly became very hard to talk about that, and we became a lot less vocal. So I think my main takeaway in this is just, well, first of all, we need reliable investigators, and we can't be asking ourselves these questions of who is this going to help, who is it not going to help? That's the route to bad journalism. It's the route to bad science. It's a dead end. Yeah. But I think more broadly, we also have to understand that people have very good reasons to be suspicious of elite power, and if we become so reactive that we cede that territory, it's just the biggest gift to the far right that we could ever offer them.
Let's talk a little bit about, I would say, a chapter that was really touching in your book where you write about your son. You can tell us a little bit about that in a minute. it builds a little bit on this point around how do we talk about sensitive topics like vaccines. I was pregnant during the pandemic, and as much as I pride myself on being pro-science and whatnot, I sat down and went, is it all right for me to take the vaccine when I'm pregnant? I don't really know. There was a lot of conflicting information out there, and it was difficult to find good information without reading a whole science paper, which is not always, even as a science journalist, was not a fun thing to do. And obviously, the whole COVID vaccine denial stuff has roots in autism and MMR, which is what you cover in this chapter. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your decision to write this chapter, focus on your son, and kind of really talk about your own personal feelings and reactions to this idea of the tension of what to believe and how to get information.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that, because I do think it was, I feel like people who are pregnant had such a hard time with like making this decision, because I think the science communication on it was really unclear. It was just like, don't worry, it's fine. And then you had all of these wellness influencers saying, no, you can't even be around anybody who's vaccinated. They'll shed their vaccines on you, and you'll miscarry and all of that. I mean, this is still going on, and but I didn't really hear simple explanations of when when you're pregnant, your immune system is suppressed so that you don't reject the fetus, so you're actually much more vulnerable to a virus like COVID. So there's an extra reason why you might want to consider it. But the idea that this was an easy decision, I mean, when I was pregnant, I didn't eat soft cheese, I was very careful.
Right.
Like, it's a completely reasonable set of questions that I think were sort of treated often quite dismissively, and it was hard to get information about it. So that's a bad situation. That's what drives people to get their information from Instagram influencers.
Yeah.
One of the through line of the book is the double. Is the way in which we create these doubles of ourselves, and also the way we have these collective doubles. And the double that I most fear is and I found in my deep dive into doppelganger literature and film that doppelganger stories are often used as metaphors for the fear of the fascist flip. Because what we know about societies that flip fascist from within is that the nice neighbor down the street can suddenly be turning you in, and the kid who's playing with a ball is suddenly carrying a gun. And it's that sort of pregnant possibility, right? That everything can change, it can flip and become very dangerous. And so, films like Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator are working with that tension, right? He plays both the Jewish barber and the great and the Hitler-esque Führer, and then one disguises as the other. But it's the nearness of it that is scary. That is really, really scary. And I have friends in India and Italy who say, it's happening, it's flipping. I have friends in Florida who feel that way, frankly. So the book winds its way to that, and one of the stories that I tell, just to back up a little more, is in all of these, I call it conspiracy culture, not conspiracy theory, because it is a culture and it really does not have a coherent theory. It's not fair to theories to call it a conspiracy theory. It's moving around wherever the heat is. But within this culture, the figure of the child is the primary battleground. The idea that the child is under attack. The child is under attack by masks. The child is under attack by vaccines. The child is under attack by learning the true history of their countries. The child is under attack by the healthcare system. Transness is an attack on the child. And I think that in moments when things feel very uncertain and people are afraid, these can become hyper-patriarchal moments where the control over the nuclear family, control over women's bodies, control over children intensifies. And we're seeing many, many, many examples of that. So I look at the child as double, like the idea that the role of the child is not to be their own independent being in this world, and that our job as parents is to help them find that person and support that journey, but rather to replicate ourselves, to have a little mini me who is going to extend our lives, right? I mean, we certainly see this in the way, children are named after parents, and it's kind of promise of immortality, essentially. So I have a neuroatypical child, and he's very much on his own journey, and being, I've never written, or I don't write or speak about his inner life, his journey, his diagnosis, his anything, because I feel really strongly that part of supporting him as an individual is not to make the decision for him about what about his inner life is public. So he's an incredibly interesting person. I could fill a book with what it is like to be his parent. He will decide whether he writes that book or not. So I don't write about him except to say that being his parent has exposed me to a world that I think is very relevant to some of this derangement that I'm discussing, which is the autism parent community, which is a place I've come to know over the past decade, and it has some very wonderful people in it. And it has some people who are very, very, very angry that their children are different, who are looking for someone to blame, who are looking for magical cures, who engage in therapies that I think are abusive in their determination to extinguish behaviors that they consider aberrant because this child does not conform to their idea of a duplicated self. So I write about that because I think it's an important piece of this puzzle. And in terms of understanding, in the shock doctrine, I talk about how during times of crisis, it's the ideas that are lying around that tend to be able to move very quickly in those moments of shock. And some of the ideas that were lying around and the communication infrastructures were able to move very quickly during COVID into this disinformation sphere because they were already doing it before about the autism vaccine lie link, okay? So, I mean, somebody like RFK Jr. who's running for president is, at the center of this with Children's Health Defense, I think it's called Children's Health Defense Fund. But yeah, I'm glad that you asked me about it. I think people have been afraid to ask me about it because I'm very specific in the book about what I say and what I don't say. I don't use his name, I just use his first initial. I did talk to him about it, and there's also this very, there's a terrible history of genocide of neurodivergent kids, and so I get into the history of Hans Asperger. We don't use the diagnosis Asperger syndrome anymore because of what is now known about Hans Asperger, who was a doctor in Nazi-occupied Austria, or Nazi-controlled Austria, and he, before fascism rose in Austria, he had been a seemingly kind of a nice, interested doctor who actually was against there being a diagnosis for autism. He said that these are just different ways of being human. He didn't think it needed to be pathologized. But then once the Nazis were in power, he started talking about autism pathology, and he sorted these kids into what he called his little professors, who he thought could be useful to the party, and other kids who were not, who he signed transfer orders, and many of them were killed. So it's a very ugly chapter, obviously, but I think it's important to understand where this sort of quest for purity can go. And a lot of what what I get into in the book has to do with this sort of quest for the pure body, the super immune system, like the appeals to purity and the idea that the vaccines are the pollutants. Yeah. A lot of the anti-vax folks in the US call themselves purebloods. Do you know this? It's quite shocking, actually, that would be something that's happening, but it really is. Yeah.
Building a little bit on, you said it's an ugly chapter, and you talked about the kind of ugly history. I think my sort of favorite theme that comes out in the book, I guess, is your crescendo towards the end, is this idea of we're starting to understand a lot more ugly histories and we can't handle it. And part of the reason, or part of what you think might be the reason that people are drawn to these more conspiracy spaces, or spaces that, you talked about, it gives them a twisted image of self-respect, or an angry reassertion of innocence. This idea of being able to say, it wasn't me that did this, or this is not right, that not being able to handle the craziness or the ugliness of our past.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about, you talked about the double as, the bad part of ourselves. It was making me think of, no ethical consumption under capitalism. We all want to be good. We all want to make the right decisions, and we find it very difficult to deal with the guilt of doing the wrong thing. And maybe for some people, that's what drives us into these spaces. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this kind of idea of denial is so much easier than looking inward, and therefore what it meant for you to look inward and think more deeply about that through this journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can handle those histories, but I don't think we can handle it on our own. And that's the tricky thing, is that we have been living through some pretty extraordinary excavations of the truths of our countries, the truths of our economic orders. COVID itself played that role for the lockdown class, because we were only able to stay home because so many people who were bearing so much more risk than us were out there picking food, making food, delivering food, caring for the elderly, caring for us when we were sick in COVID wards. Risk was so unevenly distributed, but the nature of an airborne virus is it forced a reckoning with the fact that we are enmeshed bodies, and epidemiology itself, it's treating us as a whole, not as individual bodies. So in this really profound way, it's a challenge to the central narrative of capitalism that we are just responsible for ourselves and maybe our nuclear family, but any success we have is just our own, and anybody else's failure is their problem because they didn't work hard enough. And then suddenly we have to be alive to all of these interconnections. And I think some of us were really happy about it. And it's worth remembering the kind of beautiful solidarities of those early months. And I'm not just talking about applauding for healthcare workers, although I don't think people should be embarrassed about that. I know there's a lot of embarrassment about that. I think we should be embarrassed that if we failed to fight for living wages for the people we were clapping for, but that kind of appreciation, I think, is sorely missing in our culture. And so and also like the mutual aid networks that were set up, and all the different ways that people welcomed the apparition of a social state, a government that might have paid people to stay home. And we saw actually a government can function if it wants to, if it chooses to. It can act like an emergency as an emergency. So not everybody welcomed that, and I mentioned the trucker convoy that occupied, the capital of my nation, which was kind of like, they were screaming freedom, and it was this strange kind of doppelganger of the sorts of collective movements that I've been a part of. I could recognize things of it, like that sort of like, we took the city, like they were so psyched, I could feel that, but it wasn't really a collective movement. It was a collection of individuals coming together to say, leave us alone, right? So at the same time, part of what I've tried to tease out is why there were two mass movements in the COVID era. There were the anti-lockdown protests that are saying, leave us alone, we're not responsible to anyone. But there was also the 2020 racial justice uprising that may have begun in the States, but I know it came here, and it came to Canada, and it continued in Canada into a reckoning about the genocide that it was the residential school system. And we learned more and more about those institutions that had no right to call themselves schools, which had cemeteries and were just abuse factories. And it was so horrifying when these revelations came out in 2021, that Canada actually canceled its national holiday in a lot of cities. And Trudeau announced that it should instead be a day of reflection. So I think there's a connection to that kind of excavation and the fact that just a few months later, you have the Capitol being taken over with thousands of Canadian flags that didn't come out on Canada Day, and with these shouts of freedom, but not just shouts of freedom, shouts of the vaccine is a genocide. Yeah. I can't breathe through my mask, right? Like appropriating the slogan of the Black Lives Matter movement. All these weird appropriations. Every Child Matters, which is the slogan of the movement that is fighting for justice in the face of the residential school genocide, that is suddenly being used to talk about the vaccines and so on. So it's weird, but I do believe we can handle it. I mean, I think it's hard. I think it's very, very hard to look at reality. Yeah. And I think the problem is we live in this culture that tells us we can shop our way out of it, or we can DEI our way out of it. We can confront our white fragility, and sure, yes, we should do all of that, but that is not going to be enough. And the weight of it is too much for the individual project. And so I think, I think there's lots of reasons why selves are breaking. I think we just put too much onto the self in this culture. Not just these reckonings, but also just, how much the self, that's what personal branding is. You're not going to get a job, you're not going to get a pension, so get out there and promote yourself. Yeah. People aren't doing it because it's fun, they're doing it because they're scared, right?
Yeah. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to go to questions of the audience. I think there are 2 roaming mics. I can't actually see very well, so when we get to questions, we're going to have to put the lights up a little bit, just an FYI. But get ready with your questions, and we'll be coming to you in just a second. The last question I want to ask you, Naomi, which is another culminating theme, this idea of the people in this mirror world, or, denial is so much easier than looking inward, and so on and so forth. And you ask this question of, okay, well, what are the rest of us in denial about? Because we are not seeing clearly as well, surely to goodness, and we can't just be perfectly seeing. And I like that you said that you admire that those in conspiracy spaces, they still believe in the idea of changing reality. I thought that was a really lovely way of putting it, particularly, there's that famous quote, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And building on this point around, capitalism as the true conspiracy, or capitalism as the true scam, but, we not in the mirror world see what they are talking about is conspiracy and scam. What does it mean for the rest of us to see more clearly? How can we see more clearly? How can we see the real, quote unquote, conspiracies around us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need to value systemic analysis more, popular education that actually explains how our world works. I think a lot of the reason why people believe that there's a room somewhere where they're being plotted against is because capitalism is failing them. They can't afford their grocery bills, let alone rent, let alone a mortgage.
And there is someone in a room scheming. There are consultants putting the prices up.
There are, and it's not to drain children of their adrenochrome. No. It's just to pursue the logics of capitalism, right, which is endless profit and growth. And so like the basic mechanics of this system have never been explained. In fact, people have just been told it's about freedom and Big Macs and rainbows and a meritocracy. So, this is why if we look at left history, there's a lot of pamphleteers and people selling newspapers and having meetings and trying to explain. And a lot of them were Jewish, organizers who understood that if they didn't explain that there was this system called capitalism, then people were going to believe the guy who was telling them that it was all the Jews and the money-lending Jews who were responsible for all of their woes. So, this pattern repeats throughout history, and I think the center is not holding. So it's not going to be. We have a politician in Canada right now who's trying to unseat Justin Trudeau. He's a conservative, but he's the new kind of conservative. So his campaign slogan is "Canada is broken." Mm-hmm. And he's going around listing all the ways in which the country feels broken to people, and it's really resonating. And the reason why, partly why it's resonating, is because Trudeau is saying, everything's great. We did this, we did that, and people are going, this does not match my life. It does not match my life. So, I think the need for honest speech that recognizes that people can handle complex thoughts, even some big ideas. I mean, this is the thing about, I hesitate to say his name, but, if you listen to Jordan Peterson, one of the things that's interesting is, I think people like that he talks about big ideas.
Yeah.
That he has these sort of psychoanalytic references, and he is not talking down to them exactly. It's not just in sound bites.
Yeah.
So I think people can handle more. People are hungry for systemic analysis, in fact. And we really have to do it, and we can't just be reactive, and we need to be coming from a place of legible values, like what values govern our behavior? What do we believe about human beings, right? Do we believe we really are equal? How does that manifest? What does that mean about what is happening on our borders? What does it mean about the way we see our children? And I think we just need to be speaking very plainly about what is happening in the natural world as well, which I think is a really, really resonant message. And we start to think that this is not popular because it isn't being, reported in the media in the same way, and we don't have politicians who are in any way, with a few exceptions, well, I'm here, so that's not true. There are politicians who can speak about the natural world, I think, with some passion. But, I was on a BBC show yesterday when they announced, shortly after the Rosebank announcement. There was a Tory MP who, of course, as you would expect, was saying this is part of the green transition. But there was also a Labour MP who said the exact same thing. That is truly shocking. So I think the ability to speak plainly about clean air and clean water and the right to a livable future for everybody, without sort of feeling self-conscious about the plainness of that speech, I feel like is really vital right now. Some of the reality that I most cherish.
Okay, well, talking of plainness of speech, we're going to go to questions, and I've been told you've already been warned that a question is one sentence, maximum 1 comma, that has a question mark at the end. So we've only got about 10 minutes for questions. We're going to take one from each of the mics. You've got something to write notes just in case, for inches of time. So who are we getting first? Let's go to this mic, Mary's mic first.
There you go. We've got one here, and then if JJ wants to hand over that way.
Okay, Mary, this is a gentleman there. Off you go.
How would you recommend speaking to friends or family who are becoming embroiled in this mirror world, specifically like COVID denial and Andrew Tate?
Oh,
how would you recommend speaking to friends and family that have ended up in this mirror world?
Yeah.
And the other question, yes?
I'd love to know, have you had any response from Naomi Wolf about this book? And had she haunted you back?
Thank you very much for your succinct, plain speech questions, Naomi.
Those are very succinct. I'll start with the second one. No. No, nothing direct. You can check out her Twitter feed. There's lots of oblique things. I did try to interview her and didn't hear back. I reached out in various ways. And I think that if she were to read the book, I would hope that she might be pleasantly surprised that it is, one, not about her, and two, not cruel and mocking, and in fact, quite critical of people who have been, I think, just unnecessarily cruel and mocking. I don't think it's a great approach, and I do think it pushes people further away. Which brings me to the friends and family question. Now, there have been a lot of severed relationships during COVID, and often for good reasons, but people are feeling very, very judged, very, very mocked. And all the social science on this shows that if someone is to be brought back, it will be precisely by friends and family, not by me. They're not going to read my book. I told you I've sold out to the globalists. it's going to be because somebody who they have a pre-existing trusting relationship treated them as if they were worth speaking to. And that doesn't mean agreeing with abhorrent Andrew Tate ideas, but it might mean recognizing that there might be real feelings about whether or not the world has a place for them. Extending some kind of a bridge. Maybe talking, if we're talking about the vaccine issue, I think there are some people who maybe will never come back, but there are folks who, it's really coming from a very legitimate anger and fear at Big Pharma. I bet there's lots of people here who are not fans of Big Pharma for their own reasons, and that would be the example of a place where you might be able to extend a bridge. If these relationships are totally severed, it's pretty much impossible that people are going to come back based on any kind of argument, because you're not actually asking them to change their mind. You're asking them to lose all of their friends and all of their social connections, right? If they're isolated, then this is all they have, so they're going to cling to it much more tightly. So it's a really good idea to keep lines of communication open if you can, if it feels safe.
Thank you.
So we've got time for 2 more. I'm going to read one from online, and then JJ can take one at the back. So this one is from Noor. Do you think that conspiracy culture is linked to the need to be some sort of hero, as if they know a truth that will save the people?
Ooh, nice one, Noor. And one from over here.
What are your thoughts on creative ways that we can dismantle the power structures that fuel the polarization between the two worlds?
Lovely. That's a lovely question to end on, right? We're just going to do those last 2. Okay, thank you for that.
So good. Oh, this was so nice. Thank you. Thank you, Gemma. I really enjoyed this conversation. So that, I think that to answer Nora's question about this desire to be a savior, save the people, maybe. I've heard that theory. There's certainly some pleasure in some of this. It's kind of like detective work, like particularly in the Q sphere. I am more struck that there is a fantasy of justice in conspiracy culture, right? It isn't just that you are calling out big pharma, big tech, et cetera. It's that you have a very simple and almost cartoon-like kind of Hollywood narrative about how you are going to arrest those 10 people and bring them up on war crimes trials or trials against crimes against humanity. I don't know if you have these bumper stickers, but where I am, I sometimes see bumper stickers that say, "Make the Nuremberg Code great again," which is code for arrest Fauci and Gates and Schwab. But I get it. Not arrest them, but I get that you want to do something about injustices. And this raises an important question of what is the vision for accountability on this side of the mirror world? I mean, we all groan about late capitalism and have all of our critiques, but what is the plan for changing it, for having real accountability? I mean, I believe we should sue big oil, put them out of business, use their money to pay for the transition. That's one idea I have for justice. I think we need more of those types of ideas that are, not about locking people up, but are absolutely about redistributing wealth, that are absolutely about making polluters pay, that actually have a little bit of a feeling of justice to them. And if we don't have it, I don't think we should be surprised that there is an attraction to a story, like literally white hats arresting the black hats. I mean, that's the story of QAnon. So the very good question about the power structures of how we dismantle this. I was really, I'm interested in your perspective on this as well. I mean, around. I think there's a hope that there might be some technological solution to the misinformation, right? And I think there are some, but the tricky thing is that you can just hop to your own platform, right? And we've seen what some of that looks like in recent days. So the ability to control attention, is not in our hands. But what would you say to that?
I mean, there might be some hope in a technological solution.
Yeah.
I wouldn't put my hope in a technological solution, especially given the way that, I mean, we can point to organizations like Signal and the way that they are run, but there's not, most technological organizations are not exactly, I mean, they're capitalist organizations, right? So if we're looking at for a technological solution, then we have to be cognizant of how technology is constructed, built, socially formed and whatnot, which is through the same systems that we're trying to get rid of. So I wouldn't necessarily pin my hopes on that. I think it goes back to your point earlier on about systems and not dumbing down this idea of explaining things. I mean, when did we ever have talking, how often was, supply chain in the news during COVID? Nobody, it would be like, no one's interested in supply chain. I tried to pitch a piece on supply chains years ago, and the editor was like, nobody cares about supply chains. And then COVID, everyone wants to know why their toilet roll hadn't got from A to B, right? There's like a hunger for these system stories. And, I really hate in science journalism this idea of, dumbing down the story to people that don't understand science. It's a load of rubbish. And so for me, I think, maybe this is a more high-level idea than suing big oil, but I think there's a lot of scope in there around being very blatant and obvious about systems and being very blatant and obvious about the fact that they are not just simple, that they are structures, and that, but they are explainable, they are understandable, and frankly, they're also very interesting if you're kind of nerdy like me. We're gonna finish off with, unless you want to add anything.
Yeah, well, I'll just add one thing, which is, and thanks for that. I and it is, it's very tricky because we have such concentrated ownership in tech, right? So a lot of this kind of solutions end up giving more power to people who already have a lot of power, right? And if you think about a platform like Twitter, Musk himself is a major disseminator of the conspiracy. So the idea that he is going to be providing any solutions, I think, is I'm not optimistic about that. But I think the hope, to me, is in collective action, and when I start to feel some earned hope is when I see people getting out of their individual selves and finding ways to confront those systems together, whether they're organizing as debtors to get student debt canceled or medical debt in the US, or tenant organizing, which there's been a lot more tenant organizing, or this wave of labor organizing. And the thing about all of these multimillionaires and billionaires claiming to be fighting the elites, right? Whether it's Rupert Murdoch or Elon Musk or Steve Bannon or Donald Trump, they're counterfeits. It's absurd. But they're only able to do that if there is no authenticity in the public domain. And so, when I see the rail workers union, on the news here, and this very plain spoken, frankly, class war language, you can see how it is kryptonite to some of these fraudsters. And right now in the US, where you have, just this week we've seen Trump and Biden falling over themselves for who can, get the photo op with the UAW, the United Auto Workers Union. The head of the UAW, it's a democratic organization, it's not a brand. Sean Fain ran an insurgent candidacy to become president of the UAW, and he has been leading as a left economic populist, and he's speaking very plainly about the record profits of these companies and the cost of living and wages not keeping up, and it's really firing people up. And so, we're never going to have a media ecology that is fair or representative, but when there's that kind of collective action, you have to cover it. It's the news, right? And suddenly people like Sean Fain have the megaphone, and I am telling you, he's doing more to fight misinformation and disinformation than an army of fact checkers or moderators, because he's actually showing what it really looks like. So I think we need more of that organizing, and I'm going to end with a little reading from the end of the book, which addresses Gemma's question a little bit more about looking at things that are hard. So this chapter is called Unselfing. And it deals with a concept called, that comes from Daisy Hildyard, which is, she has a different take on doppelgangers. She says that we all have two bodies, the body we're aware of, and we also have a second body. And that second body is the one that, through no choice of our own, is enmeshed in all of these systems that we've been talking about because of the clothes that we wear and the glow of our screens and the fact that we're all within this system. And it's very, very hard to look at our second body, certainly all by ourselves. James Baldwin, speaking about the double projected onto him as a black man in the United States, observed that it had everything to do with the person doing the projecting. What was a white man seeing when he saw Baldwin? It wasn't me, he said. It was something he didn't want to see. And you know what that was? It was ultimately, yes, his own death, or call it trouble. Trouble is an excellent metaphor for death. So many forms of doubling are ways of not looking at death or trouble. And death feels awfully close these days, as close as a fentanyl-laced pill, a heat dome, a hate crime, an intake of virally loaded breath. Much closer for some than for others, as usual, but not far enough, I suspect, for anyone's comfort. So how do we stop averting our gaze? How do we face our second bodies and our mortal bodies in a sustained way, rather than throwing up partitions, performances, and projections to hide from them? What would it take to stop running, to know, really know, what we already know? Some of the climate scientists whose work I most respect have come around to an understanding that there is an intimate relationship between our overinflated selves and our under-cared for planet. Charlie Veron, a legendary coral scientist who has spent a lifetime studying the Great Barrier Reef, now in its death throes, describes the journey of his life as one of decentering himself so that he has the headspace to truly see other life forms, human and non-human alike. It was a hard-won lesson, which began with losing his young daughter, Fiona, or Noni, to drowning. Leveled by personal and ecological grief, he aspires to dissolve into the reef he studies, to, quote, feel like a coral or a fish. This recalls the novelist and philosopher Iris Murdoch's description of observing something beautiful, whether a bird or a painting, as an occasion for unselfing. Veron's humbling journey to unselfing may well hold a key to our collective survival, because it means that our role here on Earth is not simply to maximize the advantage in our lives. It's to maximize, protect, regenerate all of life. We are here not just to make sure we as individuals survive, but to make sure that life survives, not to chase clout, but to chase life. This is something we might choose to learn from our double walkers. The idea that each of us has a look-alike walking around somewhere means that no one is quite as special or unique as we might have imagined ourselves to be. Within capitalism's hall of mirrors, this revelation tends to be told as a horror story. The must kill, must stab, must be the last me standing response to doppelgangers that threads its way through Western literature, film, and monotheistic religion. But there is also the option of viewing our doubles the way fake Philip Roth does in Operation Shylock. Hooray, I'm not alone in this cruel world. Because we are not alone, at least not as alone as it can feel. Connections and solidarities and kinships are available to all of us should we choose to guard the boundaries of ourselves less jealously. We have kin everywhere. Some of them look like us, lots of them look nothing like us, and yet are still connected to us. Some aren't even human. Some are coral, some are whales, and they are there to connect with if we can get out of our own way for long enough. To be clear, I'm not planning to embrace my doppelganger as a long-lost relative, but doppelgangers, by messing with our heads and our illusions of sovereignty, can teach us this lesson, that we are not as separate from one another as we might think, not as individuals, and perhaps not even as groups of individuals who have been born into various kinds of seemingly eternal fratricidal duels. Self-involvement, however it manifests, is a story in which the self takes up too much space, just as the story of Judeo-Christian Western civilization puts the human, read white, male, powerful human, at the center of the story of life on this planet, with all of it created for our species. None of it is true. Whether we are loving ourselves too much or loathing ourselves too much, or more likely, doing both, we're still at the center of every story. We're still blotting out the sun. All of which is why, over the course of this now concluding journey, I have come to embrace Naomi confusion as an unconventional Buddhist exercise. I could never quite get the hang of non-attachment before, but I think, thanks to her, I have. Thank you again. Thank you.